The Reform movement in Judaism, of which I think you know that Beth Emet is a part, began in mid-19th century Germany. It was born as a result the influence of the Enlightenment and the Emancipation. The Enlightenment, which believed that reason is the primary source of authority and legitimacy, and advocated such ideals as liberty, progress, tolerance, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state, values that we uphold today. And the Emancipation, which believed in the equality of all peoples. And the Jews in the 19th century, for the first time, really became eligible for citizenship rights. Before that, they were tolerated minorities in countries, but were not citizens of those countries, and had certain restrictions on their life there. And as we know, if we've studied Jewish history at all, that when we were no longer welcome, we were often asked to leave. As we know, most notably, after the Golden Age of Spain in 1492, the Jews were expelled from there. But that's only one of many times in our history. But this idea that was developed during the French Revolution that was going to allow peoples who weren't French to be citizens. And so Jews were becoming citizens in other places in Europe. And the Reform movement was born as a way to reconcile Judaism with the opportunity that Jews had to become full citizens with equal rights. The Reform movement wanted to focus on the universalist teachings of Judaism as opposed to our particular ways. And they uplifted what we call ethical monotheism, that the core of our faith is that God teaches us how to be good and decent human beings in the world, and we have this message to bring to the world. Another response to the Enlightenment and Emancipation is modern Orthodoxy. I know many people think that modern Orthodoxy came earlier, but it did not. It was really in response to this new moment of Enlightenment and Emancipation. That Jews could shed their traditional clothing. They could be a Jew at home in all the traditional ways, but they would be a German on the street. That they would fit into the society around them. Modern Orthodoxy was an attempt to maintain particularism of faith while integrating into society. But the Reform movement rejected particularism in large part because they felt it inhibited their assimilation into society and made them stand out. And that didn't seem to make sense in that time period, to be different than when the world was opening up and assimilation seemed like the biggest gift. And so Jews during that period gave up things like keeping kosher, wearing talit with our tzitzit, among other particularist rituals. The Reform movement originated in time and place much different than, they said, the era in which these particularist rituals had been born thousands of years earlier, and why should we keep them? They said at that time they're not applicable to our lives. They reject the wearing of the kippah. They limited the amount of Hebrew that was done in services. So why, you may ask, have we moved back to more traditional practices within our Reform movement? Well, I would argue that there are several reasons for that. In our age, it's hard to share the optimism that the Enlightenment and the Emancipation that our forebears had. Because of historical events and a developing understanding of human nature and human behavior, we've come to look at the world in a less optimistic way. Some of those events that changed the way and shaped how we looked at the world, I would say, are the Russian Revolution. But the Russian Revolution came to erase all differences between people and to elevate the universal, and one would think that would be good for the Jewish people. And as a matter of fact, I think many of you who study history know that there were many Jews who took part in the Russian Revolution because they thought this was a great way in which they would become equal members of the society. But as we now know, instead of freeing people, the result of that revolution was that many people experienced persecution and fear and state surveillance. It didn't bring that messianic era a full equality for all people. And then, of course, in the 20th century, the Holocaust shattered the faith that reason would better people's lives. We learned from the Holocaust and other things that happened, the wars of the 20th century, that scientific advances were morally neutral, that they could be used to make our lives easier, they could be used for medicine, for conveniences, but they could also be used to create ways to more efficiently kill people. And not only these historical events, but our understanding of the human psyche. That as our understanding of human psychology grew, that we understood that the Enlightenment, which elevated the rational part of who we are as human beings, didn't pay attention to how most human beings respond in the world, which is a little bit less than rational. That we need to take into account people's emotional being, and that has a strong impact on who we are in the world. And so I would say that these events and these understandings of the human being, they changed the way we in the Reform movement and many people generally thought of themselves. And so this idea of the great universalist underpinning of who we are was shaken. And in our own day, we've seen that the flattening of differences doesn't necessarily lead to equality. That as we're trying to fight racism in our country, when we say things like, we don't see color, it's not a way of recognizing the unique experience that people of color in our country experience. It's a way of denying their experience, as opposed to seeing them as equal to all, which is what many people mean when they say that. It's actually, as we know now, a denial of their unique and particularist experience. And so the 20th century became a time in which we had to reevaluate who we are as human beings, and the Reform movement had to say, who are we as religious people as well? The movement developed an appreciation for the mystery and complexity of human life and identity. And so we began to move towards some particularism in which we could explore that part of ourselves and to embrace the uniqueness of our identities. So how does this theme of universalism versus particularism play out in our Torah portion today? As I said earlier, in Deuteronomy 5, we have the repetition of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments that were given on Mount Sinai in Exodus 20 are now repeated here as Moses is giving his final set of speeches to the Israelites as they're about to enter into the land. And he wants to make sure that he reinforces the values that they need to learn so that as they go into the land, they can create a just and peaceful society. And so Moses repeats the 10 Commandments, but it's rather strange, because they're not exactly the way we find them in Exodus 20. What's different about this set of commandments? Well, in particular, there are several things that are distinct about the way that Shabbat is commanded. In the book of Deuteronomy, as we read today, we learned that the reason we celebrate Shabbat, the reason we take a day of rest, is because God freed us from Egypt. As we say in the Shabbat Kiddush, Zecher l'Tziat Mitzrayim, the Sabbath is a reminder of our going forth from Egypt, a very particular reason that we should celebrate the Shabbat. But in Exodus, we have a universalist theme. We're told we celebrate Shabbat because it's a Zecher l'Maaseh Bereshit, that it's a reminder of the creation of the world, which of course is a universalist notion. We were all part of creation, Jew and non-Jew, human being and non-human being. We're all part of that creation. So, which is it? Do we celebrate Shabbat because God brought us out of Egypt? Do we celebrate Shabbat because God rested on the seventh day and we should imitate God? Of course, we know that the answer when I ask that dichotomy is always both. You've been with me long enough to know that. But we know that some people like to focus more on one aspect of our Judaism or the other. At Beth Emet, sometimes people approach me and say, Rabbi, why do we have to talk about, or why do we have to think about, kippah and talit and doing these particular things? Why do we even have to come to prayer services at all? I mean, really, isn't the focus of what we should be doing is making the world a better place? And our social justice work is the core of what we do, period. End of sentence. Believe it or not, there are others who disagree with them here. And they approach me and they say, Rabbi, don't we need to focus a little bit more on our particularism? Otherwise, we're going to lose our Jewish identity. That we're spending so much time on all these universalist causes, but what about who we are as the Jewish people? Do you talk about that enough? Do we live that enough? Is that important enough to who we are? We need to be more particularist. And then we have the two words that begin the Ten Commandments of the commandment for Shabbat in each of the Ten Commandments. One time it says to us, shamor, that we should guard or uphold the Shabbat, and the other times it says zachor, that we should remember the Shabbat. What are we supposed to do? Remember it? Guard it? Well, as we read, or sang, I should say, in Lechadodi, we say, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. We're supposed to do both. We are supposed to remember and to uphold Shabbat. God said it, b'dibur echad, in one voice. Shamor. That we should guard ourselves. We should refrain from doing things to make the Shabbat a holy day. And Zachor, we should remember Shabbat by doing special things to make it a holy day. And then we have in our parsha the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, as we've talked about earlier this evening, reminding us that it's all one, the universal and the particular, that we need both. We need to be both spiritually oriented and justice oriented. We need to take care of our souls, and we need to care for the soul of the world. And perhaps also, through our particular ways of being in the world, we might get to the universal, that the particular doesn't have to block us, but open the door. Through deepening our particular identity, we can gain a greater appreciation and respect for others' uniqueness. The more I have become deeply invested in my Judaism and deeply understanding the particular aspects and teachings of Judaism, the closer I've become to people who are very different than I am, because I can understand and appreciate and elevate their difference. Of course, the Reform movement, we lean towards the universal, and our challenge perhaps in this day is to try to move towards the particular, without, of course, losing the universal. Be able to hold both, perhaps in tension, perhaps in harmony, as a way to challenge ourselves to continue to grow. Do I focus on one more than the other? Maybe I need a little bit more particularism in my life. Maybe I need a little bit more universalism. That in order to see the wholeness and the oneness of God, we need both. That's what we know now in our postmodern era. That as the disillusionment with modernity, that we come to a different place where we can appreciate the mystery and at the same time the responsibility to make the world a better place. As we learn in the text, some 2,000 years old, Pirkei Avot, Im ein ani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? I need to take care of myself and my particular people. Ukshani la'atzmi mi ani. But if I'm only for myself, what am I? Just selfishly, inwardly focused. V'im lo achshav ematai. And if not now, when? It's always in this moment that we need to make those choices. In this moment that we bring the oneness, the wholeness of God by upholding both our universal values and our particularist traditions. Amen.